The history of wine, the drink nobody could control. In May 1976, a small group of respected French wine experts gathered in Paris for what seemed like an ordinary tasting. The bottles were covered. The labels were hidden. No one in the room knew which wines came from France and which came from California. The judges included people whose opinions could influence reputations, prices, and entire vineyards. They examined the color, inhaled the aroma, took careful sips, and recorded their scores. Everyone expected the result to confirm what Europe had believed for centuries: great wine belonged to France. Then, the names were revealed. An American wine had won the red category. Another Californian bottle had taken first place among the whites. The judges had unknowingly placed wines from a young, largely dismissed American industry above some of France's most celebrated producers. The room reportedly turned tense. One judge wanted the scorecard returned. Much of the French press showed little interest in reporting the result. Yet a journalist from Time covered the tasting, and the story traveled far beyond Paris. What later became known as the Judgment of Paris did not merely embarrass a few experts. It damaged the belief that geography, tradition, and reputation could permanently decide what counted as greatness. For thousands of years, people had tried to control wine. Kings taxed it. Priests protected it. Merchants faked it. Scientists studied it. Critics scored it. Governments classified it. Collectors locked it in underground cellars. Wine continued to resist them all. Long before it became a symbol of wealth, romance, or sophistication, wine was probably the result of an accident. Thousands of years ago, somewhere near the Caucasus, wild grapes were gathered and left inside a container. Natural yeast living on the grape skins began feeding on sugar in the juice. Fermentation followed. The sweet liquid changed, producing alcohol and unfamiliar flavors. Someone eventually tasted it. That moment cannot be traced to a named inventor. There was no written recipe, no registered vineyard, and no person who understood the chemistry. There was only fruit, yeast, time, and curiosity. Archaeological discoveries in Georgia indicate that people were producing wine roughly 8,000 years ago. Evidence from Armenia has also revealed an ancient winemaking site containing a press, vessels, and grape remains dating to around 4000 BC. These early producers did more than wait for fruit to ferment. They began choosing better vines, protecting them, and replanting those that produced more desirable grapes. Without knowing anything about genetics, they were gradually reshaping the plant. Wine was no longer an accident. It had become a craft. In Georgia, wine is still made in large clay vessels traditionally buried underground. Grapes, juice, skins, and sometimes stems are placed inside, allowing the wine to ferment and mature in contact with the solid material. The method has survived invasions, political upheaval, religious restrictions, and industrial technology. But wine might have remained a regional tradition if it had not been embraced by the ancient Greeks. For the Greeks, wine was not simply something consumed at the end of a difficult day. It was connected to religion, theater, philosophy, and social order. Dionysus represented wine, but also release, transformation, and the temporary escape from normal behavior. Greek drinking gatherings, known as symposia, brought men together to debate politics, poetry, war, morality, and existence. Wine was commonly mixed with water. Drinking it without dilution was associated with a lack of discipline. The Greeks understood something important. Wine could bring people together, but it could also overwhelm them. Rules were necessary because the drink had its own momentum. The Romans inherited Greek wine culture and turned it into an industry. As Roman armies expanded across Europe, vineyards followed. Wine became part of military life, trade, and everyday consumption. Soldiers drank mixtures containing wine or vinegar, while merchants transported amphorae across the empire. Roman cultivation helped establish vineyards in regions that later became famous for winemaking. Areas in modern France, Germany, Spain, and other parts of Europe developed wine traditions under Roman influence. The empire spread wine farther than any previous civilization. It also found dangerous ways to alter it. Romans sometimes boiled grape syrup in lead vessels, creating a sweet substance that could improve flavor and preserve wine. They did not know that lead was slowly poisoning them. Long-term exposure can damage the nervous system, affect fertility, and impair judgment. Some historians have suggested that lead exposure may have affected members of the Roman elite, although the scale of its influence on the decline of Rome remains disputed. What is certain is that people were changing wine long before they understood the consequences. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed, trade networks weakened and many vineyards were abandoned. Knowledge that had taken generations to develop could easily have disappeared. The Christian Church helped prevent that. Wine occupied a central place in the Eucharist, which meant monasteries needed reliable supplies. Monks cultivated vineyards, documented methods, and preserved agricultural knowledge through centuries of conflict and political disorder. In Burgundy, monastic communities carefully observed how wines changed from one piece of land to another. Two nearby plots could receive similar treatment and still produce noticeably different results. The monks recorded those differences. Over time, they identified areas with distinctive soil, drainage, sunlight, and exposure. They did not possess modern instruments, but they had patience. Their work contributed to the idea now commonly described by the French word terroir, the belief that the character of a wine is shaped by the place where the grapes are grown. Some vineyard boundaries established centuries ago continue to carry enormous financial importance. A tiny parcel of land can produce bottles worth thousands because generations of buyers have accepted that its location creates something impossible to reproduce elsewhere. This raises an uncomfortable question. Are people paying for the liquid or for the story attached to the soil? In Bordeaux, that story was formalized in 1855. Napoleon III wanted France to display its finest products at the Paris Universal Exposition. Wine merchants were asked to rank leading Bordeaux estates. The classification was based heavily on market reputation and price, since expensive wines were generally assumed to be superior. The estates were divided into levels known as growths. What was intended as an exhibition guide became one of the most powerful systems in the wine business. Nearly 2 centuries later, the classification continues to influence prestige and price. Only one major promotion has taken place. Chateau Mouton Rothschild moved from second growth to first growth in 1973. Governments changed. Owners changed. Farming methods changed. Global markets changed. The list largely remained untouched. A vineyard placed near the top in 1855 inherited a commercial advantage that could continue for generations. Another estate could improve dramatically and still struggle against the authority of a ranking created under Napoleon III. Wine had been classified, but not necessarily controlled. The system simply gave the past a permanent vote in the present. Then, during the 19th century, European vineyards began dying. The first signs appeared quietly. Leaves yellowed, vines weakened, harvests shrank. Growers blamed weather, soil, and farming practices, but the damage continued spreading. The cause was phylloxera, a tiny insect related to the aphid. It had traveled from North America, probably through the growing international trade in plant material. American grape species had developed resistance over a long period of coexistence with the insect. European vines had not. Phylloxera attacked their roots, often causing fatal damage before growers understood what was happening. The crisis devastated vineyards across France and other European wine-producing countries. Families lost land that had supported them for generations. Villages dependent on grapes suffered severe economic decline. Desperate growers attempted flooding, chemicals, and strange folk remedies. Nothing offered a reliable answer. The eventual solution was deeply humiliating to some European producers. Graft the upper part of the European vine onto resistant American roots. The European plant would provide the grapes. The American rootstock would keep it alive. It worked. Today, many of Europe's famous vineyards still depend on this arrangement. Bottles marketed through images of ancient French, Italian, or Spanish tradition often begin with vines standing on American roots. The insect that nearly destroyed European wine forced the industry into an international partnership it had never intended to create. Survival did not solve every problem. For much of history, buyers could not be sure that a bottle contained what its label claimed. Wine was diluted, colored, sweetened, or blended with cheaper products. A prestigious regional name could be attached to liquid produced somewhere else. Counterfeiting was not a rare exception. In many markets, it was part of normal business. Geographical protection systems developed partly in response to this fraud. France established stronger rules during the 20th century, defining where certain wines could be produced and which methods could be used. This is why champagne refers to sparkling wine from a specific French region rather than every bottle containing bubbles. The name carries legal protection because history proved that reputation without regulation could be copied and sold. But even laws could not decide what people should enjoy. That opportunity eventually fell to critics. One of the most influential was Robert Parker, an American lawyer who began publishing an independent wine newsletter in the late 1970s. He introduced a scoring system based on 100 points, giving consumers a simple way to compare bottles. The idea appeared helpful. Wine was intimidating, filled with unfamiliar regions, producers, and terminology. A score promised clarity. Then the scores began moving markets. A highly rated wine could attract buyers immediately. Prices rose. Producers changed techniques to appeal to Parker's preferences, which often favored rich, powerful wines with ripe fruit, noticeable oak, and greater concentration. The influence became so strong that the word Parkerization entered wine discussions. It described the fear that regional styles were becoming similar because producers were chasing the approval of one critic. Wine had survived emperors, insects, and counterfeiters. Now its flavor was being shaped by a number printed beside a review. Yet the limits of authority became clear again in Paris in 1976. The French judges were not defeated by inexperienced drinkers. They were defeated by their own senses. Without labels to guide them, they chose Californian wines. The tasting did not prove that American wine was always better than French wine. It proved something more disruptive. Excellence was not the exclusive property of one country. Afterward, international wine industries gained greater confidence and attention. Producers in Australia, Chile, Argentina, New Zealand, South Africa, and other regions showed that remarkable wine could emerge far beyond Europe's traditional centers. The old hierarchy did not disappear, but it could no longer present itself as a law of nature. That may be the central story of wine. People repeatedly build systems around it. They divide land into official regions. They rank vineyards. They create tasting rules, auction records, and elaborate vocabularies. They assign points and protect names. They place certain bottles behind glass and treat them as historical objects. Then something happens that exposes how fragile the system is. An insect crosses an ocean. A monk notices that two neighboring fields taste different. A lawyer publishes a score. A group of French experts unknowingly selects an American bottle. A collector pays hundreds of thousands of dollars for a wine that may no longer taste pleasant, not because the liquid is delicious, but because the bottle has survived decades of history. At that level, wine is no longer just a drink. It becomes memory, land, status, and time sealed beneath a cork. The oldest winemakers could never have imagined the world they were beginning to create. They could not have predicted religious ceremonies, Roman vineyards, medieval monasteries, protected regions, international auctions, or blind tastings in Paris. They simply discovered that crushed grapes would change when left alone. Perhaps that is why wine has never been fully controlled. Its flavor changes with weather. Its vines depend on soil, disease, and human judgment. Its price can rise because of reputation, rarity, or a critic's opinion. A famous bottle can disappoint, while an unknown one can defeat the greatest names in the world. After 8,000 years, wine remains caught between nature and human ambition. Civilizations have shaped it, protected it, poisoned it, faked it, rescued it, and turned it into one of the most valuable agricultural products on earth. But wine has always had the final advantage. It is alive before it enters the bottle. It continues changing after the cork is inserted. And no title, classification or expert can guarantee exactly what will be waiting when it is finally opened.